Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming tonight. The structure tonight will be roughly 45 minutes of lecture and then 45 minutes of Q&A, and we'll even have time for some audience questions. I'd like to thank the students that helped organize the event, the staff of USF, Sam Bethel, Tim Rasmussen. We'd also like to thank our Dean Otko, for her support. Most importantly, I'd like to thank Jeff Silk, Naomi Silk, and the Silk family for continuing to contribute to the University of San Francisco and making the world a better place. Could we give a hand for all those people? Two other little notes. Please turn off your cell phones. And also, we will have index cards going around at some point so that you can write questions if you have a question. We did collect all the audience questions, so we have those. A lot of you might be wondering, how is our guest speaker connected to the Silk Institute and investing? Well, first, in case you didn't know, over the last 20 years, an investment in the S&P 500 of $10,000 would be worth around $50,000 today, while an investment in the Magnificent Eight would be worth $5.43 million today. But there's a second reason that is even more fascinating. The year is 1977, and a young graduate student in finance at MIT just bought an Apple II, a brand new personal computer at the time for those who don't remember. Let's call this one Guy 1. Guy 1 was trying to finish his PhD dissertation at MIT, but his money for using the mainframe was running out. He realized he needed some help. He put an ad in a local computer nerd magazine. A local guy responded and said, "Let's get together. Let's call him Guy 2. Guy 2 at the time was living in the basement of Central Square apartment without any windows and scrambling to figure out what to do with his life. He was working as a social worker at a mental institution, but his real passion was computers. So Guy 2 said to Guy 1, "Why don't I help you write the code for the troll program that you're using on the mainframe?" Guy 2 wrote the code, and now Guy 1 could finish his PhD thesis on the Apple II. Guy 1 and Guy 2 developed a small program called Tiny Troll because it was based on the program at MIT called Troll. It was then that a light bulb went off for the two men. Hey, maybe other people would like to use our program. They began selling their program for $100 on a floppy disk. Does anyone remember the floppy disk? Some people here do. Some will be too young for that. They sold lots of copies. Eventually, they were generating about $100,000 a month for two young kids. Eventually, the marketing firm they were using to sell it bought the company for $1.2 million. To put it in perspective, that's about $7 million today for two 25-year-old kids. The Guy 1 had just recently gone to Harvard, and he was making $19,000 a year as a professor. 1 year later, Guy 2 had formed Lotus 123, which brought the idea of the word processor, a spreadsheet program, and a PowerPoint program to the PC. Of course, we know later Bill Gates copied all this, and we call it Excel and PowerPoint and other things. However, Guy 2 still went on to become a billionaire from his work with Lotus 123. So who is Guy 1? Guy 1 is Eric Rosenfeld, the founder of the famous hedge fund Long-Term Capital Management. And Guy 2, of course, is Mitch Kapor. Eric Rosenfeld told me personally that he was amazed at the innovation that Mitch had. He said normally a guy in his lifetime has one good idea, but Mitch had three. He had Lotus Notes, which was basically the precursor to Outlook. He had a PowerPoint program, which was, of course, the precursor to PowerPoint. And he had the spreadsheet program, which, of course, now we call it Excel. And after all that, he started Mozilla Firefox, the browser that many prefer to Google and Internet Explorer. In 2000, our guest speaker founded the Kapor Center, and an institution that was focused on tech inclusion and social impact. The Kapor Center also houses Kapor Capital, the venture capital firm that is invested in successful companies like Uber. Could you please give a warm welcome for Mitch Kapor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. If you give me the copy for that, I will mark it up. There are a few little factual things I might want to correct, but it is still fascinating to me just how much has changed in the 50-some years that I've been working with computers, and also how much hasn't changed. And so tonight I want to share some reflections on my own journey, what things were like back in the Paleolithic era of computing when this was all getting started, and then how things have evolved to today. What's the same and what's different. So let's go back in time. Perfect. To 1966. One of those people is me, sitting at the keyboard. And the setting is, and I'm in high school, I'm 15 years old, and this is my first exposure to computers. So I'm sitting at a keyboard. The computer is the thing that looks like the oil burner to the right of, with the meters on it. And it's a first generation Bendix G15 tube computer with roughly 1/1000th the computing power of what I have on my wrist. And this was at a National Science Foundation sponsored summer program for gifted and talented youth. The US was trying to catch up with the Russians, who had launched Sputnik a few years before. In the space race, they were out there first. And part of what the US government was doing was funding programs for bright high school students to stimulate their interest in math and science. And so I was fortunate to be in this program, and it was a life-changing experience because I had access to computing, and I knew that that was something I wanted to do with my life. And it started there. Now, what happened next? An enormous detour in my own life. Life is full of detours, and this is part of my message to young folks today who may be really concerned with figuring out exactly what they're going to do in life and getting ready for it and preparing, because it's a cruel world out there. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. You saw me in +66, and then the counterculture happened, and the 60s happened, and I was off at college, and I wound up majoring, I like to say, in recreational chemistry. I actually spent most of my time in college at the college radio station, where I was a disc jockey, and then it was actually my first professional job was at a radio station in Hartford, Connecticut, playing classic rock before it was classic rock. And in the 70s, I was sort of a wandering lost soul after college. Did not know what to do with myself. I, along the way, picked up a master's degree in counseling psychology, and in fact, I was working as in the psychiatric unit of a community hospital as a mental health worker. But I was also, at night, experimenting with doing stand-up comedy. This is in Cambridge, Mass. And I realized I could make an enormous contribution to the field of human services by leaving it. So that went into my act, but I didn't really want to do comedy either. This is 1978, and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And then the Apple II happened to me. So this is a first-generation personal computer. It's hard to understand from today's perspective what a revolution it was. It was the first time an individual could really own and have full control of a meaningful computing device. That had never happened before. And so and you could play with it. It was quite open-ended. You could write programs for it. People had written games for it. Steve Wozniak, who was the co-founder of Apple with Steve Jobs, was an open and gregarious person. He did the engineering. He let us hobbyists at all of his technical papers. He just circulated them, the design documents and ideas that he had, and it was a kind of, a founding community. And I didn't know what I was going to do with my Apple II. In fact, I did not have a lot of money then. I was pretty unemployed. In fact, I was living in Massachusetts. I had to drive across the border up to New Hampshire, a couple hours away, to buy the machine because there's no sales tax in New Hampshire, and I couldn't afford it with the sales tax. This is a true story. The day after I bought this thing, I was hanging out in a computer store. Computers were sold in, retail stores back then, and I was, as I said, unemployed, and so I had a lot of time, and I observed a well-dressed gentleman in his 40s purchasing an Apple II, and I was just eavesdropping on the conversation, and he was an ophthalmologist, and he said he had some ideas about incorporating it into his practice, but I could kind of tell he didn't really know much about what he was doing. And I went up to him as if possessed by some spirit that had temporarily inhabited my body, and I said, "Sir, I'm a consultant, and I think I can help you with your problem." I was not, in fact, a consultant. I had never done anything like that. I did have, from high school and a little bit from college, some basic computer skills. And I'd had my Apple II for one day, and I figured I was a day longer than him, and if I could just stay ahead of him. And he actually hired me. And that was how I got started in personal computers at, I think, $7 an hour, which even in 1978 was not a lot of money. There were a few of us crazy people then who thought that these personal computers were going to be a big deal. But everybody who was in computing, whether it was in the business world or in academia, regarded these things as toys. And from their perspective, they were not wrong. You couldn't run a whole big business payroll. You couldn't conduct scientific experiments. They weren't good at the things that people were using computers for, but they were good at lots of things that you couldn't do previously. Exhibit A, in this regard, is a product called VisiCalc. Some of you will know, but not all of you, that VisiCalc was, in fact, the first electronic spreadsheet. A guy named Dan Bricklin invented it. He's a genius, along with his partner, Bob Frankston. They brought this to market for the Apple II in 1979. And it was a genuine revolution because it was the first truly useful thing you could do on a personal computer and not on any other kind of computer. You could build models and budgets and experiment with numbers and do all sorts of things. It was an extremely powerful tool that melded well with thinking if you were a quantitative person, and you could build your models incrementally. So a number here, a number here, a number here, let's make a formula and add that up. No, and I want to, make some other changes to it. And then you could do what if. If I change a key assumption, then everything that depends on that automatically recalculates. All of those were new ideas. They did not exist. And we saw that and went, oh my God, this really is going to be the beginning of a huge new industry. Fast forward a few years to the 1980s, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Lotus story. I had some ideas about how spreadsheets could be better. And the reason I knew about this was I had been engaged to write a program that could take tables and spreadsheets and turn them into graphs. And I did the graphing part of it early on for the Apple II, a product called VisiPlot. And I had all these ideas about combining the two and putting, there were more features. I thought this was still pretty hard to use. It could be easier to use. And I went to the VisiCalc guys and said, we ought to join forces. They were not interested in doing that. And so I was left on my own. But I was fortunate to start working with a person who was the co-founder of Lotus. And we had a set of skills which complemented each other very well, because I could do the design. I was, in modern parlance, the product manager, and John Sachs was the technical architect. When IBM announced its personal computer in 1981, that was the next big revolutionary thing that happened in the field. Until that time, personal computers, the Apple, Commodore, PET, Radio Shack, really hobbyists, people fiddling around with them. And I mean, yes, there was VisiCalc, but it was, didn't have any significant penetration in the business world. When IBM came out with a machine with the IBM name on it, the entire business world took it very, very seriously, because IBM was incredibly the leading brand in computing far and away. And they did some very smart things with the machine. They used a 16-bit processor, not an 8-bit processor. It was a lot faster, but mostly it could address a lot more memory. These early computers, they had this is hard to believe, but the Apple II had 48 kilobytes, 48,000 bytes of memory. And today we're measuring things in gigabytes. So I don't know, that's 10 to the something or other, but it's a huge difference. I could see that people were building these spreadsheet models and running out of room on the Apple II, running out of memory. And IBM, 10 times as much memory, because it was the Intel architecture. And I said, we should aim at that, because the VisiCalc guys and their publishers in IBM, there's a big oversight on their part, which is in the rush to get to market, they didn't take full advantage of the machine. It was still limited to 64K, and all that extra memory was unused, because they basically reused the same code they had written. Whereas we did this artisanal, handcrafted, assembly language, optimized every single bit and byte. And so we wound up having a product that ran like a bat out of hell, did graphing, even had an end user programming capability so that real power users could build programs on top of their spreadsheets. And it exploded into the marketplace. I didn't put up the slide with the numbers, but just to give you an idea, in our first year business, 1983, we did $53 million in sales. And in the second year, it tripled to 150 million, then 225 million. I think you need to multiply that by about 4 to get to today's dollar. So we went public in our first year. We went from 0 employees to a couple of thousand in 3 years. And I was the founder and the CEO during this period of time. So that's why they call 123 the killer app that really drove the adoption of PCs in the business world in the 1980s. And the sobering thing about it for me is, if you were, say, born after 2000, you've never heard of this, because it is ancient history. It is like the Assyrian or Babylonian Empire, replaced successively by conquering armies. 123 had its day in the 80s and into the 90s, and then Microsoft had Windows, and they put Excel in that, and that was a triumph in the 90s and into the 2000s. And these days, I talk to people, they don't actually know what Excel is. People in finance do, but if you're just using a random spreadsheet, you're probably using Google, because it's free and it's right there. And then there are things coming after that. So Lotus was a fabulous ride while it lasted. I learned a number of things. One was that I really didn't want to be the CEO of a big company. It frightened me terribly. I thought one day I would wake up and make a mistake that was as bad as some of my good decisions were good, and that the whole thing would come crashing down, and 2,000 people would lose their jobs. So I didn't understand that there's such a thing as a serial entrepreneur, someone who likes to start things and then hand them off for other people to take over. Let me see what I put up next. The biggest thing that I learned after Lotus, so this is this. Yeah, I was smart and did a whole bunch of stuff. But in fact, genius and talent is really evenly distributed by zip code. What is not is access and opportunity. And that seems unfair and unjust, that by accidents of birth and zip code, I grew up in a way at a time and in a place where I could go to this NSF program and it turned me on to computers and I got a big head start. But that is not the case for everyone by any means. And that has become inspirational to me to do something about that. So here we go. Take a look at this. So you'll recognize me on the left sitting at this thing. And this young woman, this was taken in 2011, so a while ago, Hailey Shavers, was at the time a high school student. And this shot was taken at a summer program founded by my wife and myself called SMASH, Summer Math and Science Honors, that has been in existence for 20 plus years and is still going, that gives kids from low-income communities and communities of color an opportunity to be on a college campus. This is during high school, for 3 years of high school, to get exposure to math and science in a way that can help close the academic preparation gap, but also help them understand that there's a different lane in life that they could be traveling, that they could have a career in computers. And Hailey went on to major in computer science at UC Berkeley. She works for Slack. And we have, I don't know how many now, but in the thousands of graduates of the program, because it's spread to a number of campuses. And that work, I have found, emotionally has the highest return on investment of any investment I've made, is the support for this program. This is a picture of our building in Oakland that houses a number of different organizations. I just mentioned SMASH. We have a foundation, and we have Kapor Capital. Kapor Capital does investing, and I want to talk about that since this seems like a logical focus for this venue. I did a lot of angel investing right from the very beginning, from the 1980s and on. And I found, I was fortunate to be a first investor in a number of companies that went on to do big things. So early on in the internet era, I invested in a company called UUNet, which was one of the first internet service providers. And then this is the 90s. A few years later, Real Networks, which was the first streaming media company, or one of the very first. And then around 2000, Second Life, which is the first company, virtual worlds company, which is still around. So it's always good to know what your best talent is. And mine is not programming, because I would not hire me to write code at any point, because I'm a mediocre coder. But I have an ability to see around the corners about what's coming next in tech. And I was fortunate to be able to do angel investing in those companies and on through the 2000s and into Uber and Twilio, because I was willing and able to put my money where my mouth was in this, and those things turned out to be quite successful. But Kapor Capital has a special slant on all this because it started when Freada, my wife, started nudging me about my angel investing. So this is about 15 years ago, saying, what about investing in line with your values, what you believe in, and the kinds of causes you support? And I said, my first reaction was, oh gosh, then I'm going to miss out on all the exciting deals. But she can be very persistent. I should explain about this, that Freada was someone we met originally at Lotus. She was hired right after she got her PhD. Her job description was to make Lotus the most progressive employer in the US. That was my dream. I didn't want to send a rocket ship to Mars. I was a misfit growing up, and I wanted the workplace to be one where all the other misfits would actually feel welcome and included. And so Freada and I did a lot of projects together. We were not a couple at that time, but a dozen years later in the 90s, we re-met and got together. And, but we had been professional colleagues, and she was nudging me. But we're both pretty empirical, and I said, okay, let's do an experiment. Let's see what happens if for a period of time we invest in tech startups, all of which close gaps of access or opportunity or outcome for marginalized communities. So in addition to companies that we think have the prospect of getting to be large and profitable, we want them to be good for the world in this specific kind of way. So just to dive into that in a little bit more detail, a couple hundred companies, over $300 million invested over the past decade plus. And I should say that the results have been top quartile, meaning when you compare what Kapor Capital has done, and I'm going to dive in a little bit in a minute into a little bit more detail, to venture capital firms of the same size, regardless of what their approach is to investment, we're in the top 25% in terms of returns quite consistently. So it's not just about gap closing. We have a different way of looking at what's really important about a startup. So I'm happy in the Q&A if we want to talk about anything about startups. Here I want to focus on this because it's not usually talked about and discussed because we're somewhat unorthodox. Lots of investors in tech pay attention to, do you have a CS degree from Stanford? Did you go to MIT? Do you have an MBA from Harvard Business School? They care a lot about pedigree and credentials. We really care about the founder's distance traveled. We look at where did they start in life and where have they gotten to under their own steam? What kind of challenges and hurdles have they already overcome? Because this tells you something about their persistence and their grit. We also ask, if this company that we're looking at succeeds, who's better off? And who's worse off? And is anyone left behind? We really care about outcomes. We're not a diversity-focused firm in the sense of having demographic quotas about who the founders are, but we care a lot about what value the business creates. And very often, the successful founders are ones whose own lived experience identifies the problem that their company is trying to solve. And so it's not an accident that the diversity of the founders that we have is way larger than industry norm, because very often those are the folks whose life experience identifies the kind of problems that we're investing in because we think they're going to close those gaps. So if you look at any sector, ed tech, healthcare, finance, so on, the way we look at it, we can see that some companies are what we call gap widening, and some are gap closing. There have been some startups that do matching of aspirant high school students with wealthy parents with $300 an hour tutors who are going to help in the competitive struggle to get into an elite school. And I'd argue that actually some of that is quite effective for the purpose for which it's intended. We call it gap widening because it's only good if you can afford to pay $300 an hour, so wealthy people, and so it increases the gap between rich and poor. We did a company called Numerade, $9.99 a month, unlimited access to the library of several million instructional videos and tutoring materials. I won't go through all these, but I'll just do one more. In healthcare, there are a lot of concierge medicine startups now, where if you pay extra fees, you get extra service. Is a way of addressing issues in the healthcare system. We invested in a company called Health Sherpa about 10 years ago. They power about half of the software, the sites that people use to sign up for the Affordable Care Act, for Obamacare. Not healthcare.gov, but the vast majority of all the other sites where it's a 5-minute sign-up, low friction engagement. It was designed to do that, and they have this no publicly facing profile because by their choice, but they're an incredibly important company in the infrastructure of affordable health care, and so on. So there are these kinds of distinctions that we make that about gap widening, gap closing, about distance traveled versus credentials that are central to our discourse. And one of the things I'm proud of is that some of the innovations that we have started in venture capital have spread to other firms. We are not, for instance, fans of what's called the warm intro. A warm intro is where you're a founder and you want to get some venture capitalists to fund you, so you find somebody who knows that that VC, and you go to them and you say, please introduce me, and so I can sort of cut to the head of the line, get an audience, and so on. We think that gives an advantage to people who are well-networked, but being well-networked has nothing to do with whether you have the ideas and the persistence to become a great founder. So we actually have open access if you want to get funded by Kapor Capital. It starts with on the website and answering a few very specific kind of questions that help us get an orientation about the company, and we follow up from there. And everybody does that, whether they know us or don't. And we have, in fact, funded companies where we had absolutely no connection with them. And it really gives everybody an equal and fair kind of shot. And so there's still considerable room for improvement in the venture capital industry, but we're hard at work on it. And in fact, we turned over the running of the firm, this is myself and Freada, my arm around her, to our younger partners, Brian Dixon and Ululi Onavakpuri, both of whom we'd been working with for 10, 12 years. We turned over the running of the firm to them in 2021. They went and raised a third fund, Kapor Capital 3, $126 million fund, which they're now investing out of. And it is sometimes quite important to give up your seat at the table and let the next generation show what they can do. And so that's an enduring lesson. I found, surprisingly, the last decade, when we've done this kind of investing, to be incredibly rewarding because you feel like you're actually making a difference in the world. I love working with the young entrepreneurs, And I'm pleased that we have a track record that shows you can actually also make a whole bunch of money while doing it. And to me, that's the kind of disruptive innovation in people's thinking that we're trying to bring about. So much more to talk about, but I think it's going to be done better Q&A and questions from the audience. So thank you.
So I have a set of questions, some of which were audience submitted through the website. So we have all kinds on all kinds of topics, and for those, if we don't get to the question you want to ask, you can go over here, and we'll get to the audience questions as well. So I'm going to start with some soft stuff. After school, you were living in the basement of an apartment building in Central Square. And what's your advice? And you really didn't know where to go with your life. So what's your advice to young students about how to navigate the early years of a career?
Probably the most frequent piece of advice I've given on this is when you're taking a first job or an early job, I think what you want to do is maximize your learning opportunity. You want to be in a situation where you can interact with lots of different people, do lots of different things, learn as much as you can, because that's going to help you make choices about what you really want to do and where you want to go next. So optimize for that. Don't optimize for a particular big name brand employer. Make sure you don't get stuck in a corner somewhere doing some endlessly repetitive task. So I think, that's my best piece of advice.
Okay,
I think also you got to be patient with yourself, because some people know what they want to do from a very young age, and other people like myself and many others, it takes a while to figure it out. And so try something, and if that doesn't work, figure out what's not working and try to, pivot and go in a different direction. And that often works out just fine.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to ask another one related to that a little later, so we'll have more. You've been very successful by many standards, and I ask this a lot, but how much of your success, and I'd like percentages, is luck, hard work, and just intelligence?
Well, from what I said before, you obviously know that I think a significant part of it is luck. What zip code you're born into, and in fact, what century you're born into. So let's call that a third, okay? I think talent is also really important, so let's give that a third. And hard work is the other third.
Okay, thank you.
So when you don't know what the distribution is, what you always say is a third, a third, a third. Because...
So let's talk about venture capital a little bit. You mentioned some things, and I have some other types of questions here. Can you name, maybe three is too many. Let's start with one or two, but two great companies that you invested in. What was your thought process? How did you know to invest in them? And what's the lesson? And then two very bad companies that you invested in. And what was the thought process and what was the lesson?
I'm going to do one of each just for brevity. But years like 1992 or 93, so there's no Amazon, there's no Netscape, there's no internet as we know it. It is just before that. But the Pentagon had turned over the nascent internet to the National Science Foundation to run while they said we want to open it up and try to figure out what to do with it. But at the same time, the telephone companies were saying, deregulate us and let us run fiber to the home, and we'll build the information superhighway. And nobody took the internet seriously as a thing that ordinary people would use. I placed a bet on UUNet, which I mentioned, which was an ISP, one of the first companies you could go to buy an internet connection and get connected up, either as an individual or as a business. Because I felt that the connectivity and the openness of it, the fact that it was totally decentralized, was going to produce enormous innovation, and that would be the architecture that people would want to use, and that turned out to be right. Nobody in Washington, D.C., or in the big tech companies, including Microsoft, thought that that was the case. So UNet investment in like 3 years returned like 300 to 1, so that was a good one, and it became a very important company. A bad investment. We made, over the span of a decade at Kapor Capital, a couple hundred investments. About 5 of them, so that's 2% or so, turn out to be run by people who committed criminal acts of behavior, fraud, misrepresentation, and so on. Some of which wound up being incredibly expensive, losses in the tens of millions of dollars. The mistake was just being a little naive about what could go wrong. And the way I explain it is the following. I was a great angel investor, and in around 2000, I spent a couple years as a VC with Axel Partners in Palo Alto, Series A, they did the Facebook investment. And I hated it, and I was no good at it. And I went back to angel investing. It was sort of like if you're a teacher and you're doing great at teaching, first grade and second grade, and then all of a sudden you try to teach middle school and you just are overwhelmed by all of these, adolescents and their crazy hormones, and you're no good at it, and you go back to teaching first grade. So, and I'm not trying to say that early, seed stage founders are like first graders, but I was really good at the early stages of working with founders because you're doing basics. They're developing basic skills, of running a business, and you're getting them ready for the next stage when things are more competitive. The mistakes came when I shifted and went back around 2017, 18, and made some investment in Series A companies playing with large amounts of money, forgetting it's a cold, cruel world out there. Not everybody is ethical. People will lie to you and take shortcuts. And I was used to, all these sort of nice, little kids playing on the playground together, and really got caught up, and it was a lesson. Anytime you're talking about 7-figure investments, it's like what Ronald Reagan used to say: trust, but verify.
Thank you. So
expensive mistakes.
So you're better at angel investing, and that's in a way ironic because some people argue that's the hardest area to do investments.
Well, it's hard to do. This is such an interesting thing because over the years I've talked to people who are really great at private equity, and there are lots of numbers to look at. You can crunch numbers on the models and the operating margins and derive wisdom out of that. I have no aptitude for that. In a little startup, it's just a founder or two and some ideas and maybe a few slides, like no code. So there's nothing quantitative to analyze. You have to use a different set of faculties to judge what's the likelihood that these folks are going to succeed. And is it a function of that there's a huge market opportunity? Is it a function that there isn't significant competition, that it's been overlooked? I mean, what's the most important thing? How important is the character of the founder in this? And I'm pretty good at that, but don't hire me at a private equity firm.
Okay, thank you. So someone has said that one of your skills, and maybe this is related to angel, is to be able to see around the corner what's coming next. So can you tell us right now, because we might want to go out tomorrow, what is coming around the corner?
So like lots of folks in tech, I am obsessed with AI. No surprise there. By the way, finance folks note today that one company lost $600 billion of value in its market cap, called NVIDIA. That's got to be some kind of record. This thing that just was announced, this thing called DeepSeek that some of you have heard about, it is the thing that I've been waiting for to happen, because until DeepSeek, what it looked like is you can only play seriously in AI if you have tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. And that restricts the players to a handful. And I'm sitting thinking, in all the past regimes of tech, things have gotten cheaper, like radically cheaper, very rapidly. Why here would there not be an enormous incentive to find a much less expensive way to train these models? But I'm not in it day to day. I'm reading and thinking. And so when DeepSeek came out, and so for a $6 million investment, they were able to build a large language model that's pretty much state of the art, that otherwise would have cost like 30 times as much money, something like that. Different set of techniques, and they had incentive, scarcity of chips, and so everybody is now tearing apart their technical papers to satisfy themselves how they really did it. But it's a game changer because it's very good for startups. It means AI, the basic stuff that powers all this, is going to be cheap, if not free, and ubiquitous, and it will not be controlled by the oligarchs. So what I see coming around the corner, now look, that's both good and bad. I mean, I'm excited because there'll be lots of great startup opportunities. But what did we get wrong about the internet, those of us who were there in the early days? We did not understand that every bad thing that people are capable of doing, they will do in an amplified fashion on the internet. I mean, we're all pretty nice people, and we just weren't traveling in those circles and didn't have the worldly sophistication, and boy, were we dumb. Similarly with AI, all of the horrible things you can imagine people doing if they have enhanced intelligence, they're going to do them, and we are not prepared for it. And so I'm not saying this is like going to end human life as we know it, but there will be disasters of one kind and another that are unanticipated, and people go, oh, how terrible. And we should, as a priority, be, and some people in AI safety are still doing that, but the enthusiasm in the commercial world around AI is, no, let's just run as fast as we can and do as much great stuff as we can. And my prediction, what I see coming around the corner, is we'll be sorry.
Okay, thank you.
But there could also be, probably will be, more unanticipated major research breakthroughs in the next few years that only if you're in the labs or know someone in the labs do you have an inkling of what they're going to be. And I don't have that access currently, so I expect not a stable picture, but continued upheavals.
Thank you. So we're gonna get to some audience questions in a second. I have a couple more. One is a weird question. Please don't start throwing tomatoes, but I want to ask it. So you talk a lot about closing the gap, and my question is as follows: why does it matter? And let me preface a little bit more. Is it because inherently you believe in some kind of equality amongst people? Is it because you think you'll find good ideas that are just not being tapped, or something else?
I got picked on a lot as a kid and bullied a lot until I kind of grew out of it. I would like to have a world where there's less of that. I would like to be in a world where there genuinely is equal opportunity for people to become what they can become. And I think that, my values are that's the kind of world I want to live in. There's a famous political philosopher named John Rawls, no longer alive, and he had this concept called the veil of ignorance, which is to pose the question to say, okay, go ahead and design the ideal society, but the catch is you don't know what part of it you're going to be born into. You could be born anywhere, in any geography, in any social class, in any religion. So now go ahead and tell me what kind of world, would you set up institutionally? Okay, so I think that was a smart idea, and that aligns around my values.
Thank you. So we're going. Yeah.
Unfashionable, I understand, in today's political climate.
Let me ask a couple that we sort of ask. And what is something you've learned from a family member that's helped you in either your personal life or your career?
Well, I didn't understand this until later, but my father was an incredibly ethical guy. He just did not believe in taking kind of shortcuts or in taking advantage of people. And he didn't teach that or preach that, but I somehow absorbed that, and I'm thankful and grateful for that.
That's great. So we are now going to move to audience questions. Thank you. And so hopefully we get some of your questions. They're all here, and we'll be doing some more live questions where you get to stand up. But these are all audience questions that were mailed in. What's the most common mistake you see startups make in their early stages, and how can they avoid it?
The most common mistake. There's so many of them. I'll answer a slightly different question. The most irritating mistake is one in which the founder comes across as thinking that they have all the answers. So that no matter what question you ask, it's not met in a spirit of friendly critical inquiry. It's how smart I am and I've got all this figured out. That can't possibly be true. So I would say overconfidence is one kind of mistake, and then underconfidence is its complement. Most founders are scared as first-time founders because it's a scary thing trying to make something out of nothing. And I would say trusting yourself, not trusting yourself is also a mistake. That you and your team, very often, if you trust yourselves, you can figure out these hard problems and what to do.
But I guess, I don't know about the audience, but my impression is that most founders are very confident people, and that's not true.
It actually depends to a significant degree on where people come from, because if you are, if you've grown up in a way that you've gone to the right schools and gotten early access and gotten rewarded for a lot of that, yeah, you're probably going to be confident. If you just have a lot of raw talent, well, it might not be that way. In fact, the reason I didn't say this when I showed the slide, that summer program was so important to me. It was the first time I had been with a cohort of other kids like myself where you could be rewarded for being smart, not be punished. And that's what I understood was important about SMASH, this Summer Math Science Honors Academy. You have to give kids an experience of positive reinforcement for exercising their talent and potential, even if they're not getting that in their community or in their circumstances. So I would say underconfidence coming from founders who come from more marginalized backgrounds, that's the more common case.
Thank you. This is an audience question about successful and least successful, and we've already asked that. But let me, since everyone's been in an Uber here, I think, you invested in Uber very early on, and do you mind telling us why you made that investment?
Sure. And I should say that the Uber investment was made 2009, 2010. It was prior to adopting the gap closing investment strategy that I described for Kapor Capital. In fact, it was during the period of time when Freada and I were sort of discussing how to do these things. So Uber, I was in the first round of Uber when it had a $4 million valuation. So I think it's had up to a $200 billion valuation. So that's what, how was it, 50,000, 5,000? Had a big multiple. I knew the founder, the real founder, not Travis, who became the CEO and who's the public face of the company for many years, but a guy named Garrett Camp, because I had invested in his previous startup. And I just thought he was talented, and if he was doing a new business, I wanted to be in it. So that, proves the value of knowing the right people. But the ironic twist is this: the business of his I want to invest in, his other investors wouldn't let me in. They thought I was in something competitive. So I said to him, okay, Garrett, what else are you working on? And they described the idea for Uber to me, which at that point had nothing. It was just the ability to summon a car service, a black cars, not about taxis or revolutionizing transportation or anything. And I went, oh, well, that's sort of interesting, but let me know. And about a year later, he called saying, we're doing around here. I've got $75,000 set aside if you want to take it. And I said, I'm in. I didn't think too much about it. Here's what happened. They struggled a lot in the early days to get the software to work at all, partly because connectivity on the iPhone was still pretty raw. It was uneven and not very fast. The GPS barely worked. The maps weren't good. But when it all came together enough that you could use it, you could request a ride, and you'd see this little black dot on the street map getting closer and closer to you. I mean, and you knew that this thing was actually going to come get you. It had a galvanizing effect for anybody who'd been left in the lurch. Where's my car? Where's my ride? I'm going to be late. It was like magic. And we knew, oh, this could be a big thing. This could be a really big thing. So it was sort of being willing to believe that the technology was going to mature enough and that they would figure out the business model and 1,000 things like that. But trust me, no one in the first year or two understood that Uber was going to become a huge thing.
Okay, thank you. These are still...
I have to say, in all fairness, if Travis had been the CEO, and he was the one that both built the company but also created a toxic culture, I don't think we would have invested for that reason. In fact, we wrote, Freada and I, a public letter at the point at which Uber was just trashing itself as everything was coming out about the awful way they were treating employees. We wrote a thing that said he needs to step down, the board needs to take action on this. And we were just ostracized by a significant part of the investment community because you never criticized founders publicly. But we felt we had to.
Thank you. Another audience question, and then I think we'll move to some of these live audience questions so we hear other people. In your opinion, how disruptive has the internet and all that entails become? For example, kids growing up with minimal social interaction, people not engaged in what is in front of them, might also be causing depression in our society. Wow, this is a lot of stuff. In addition, what does it portend for democracy with all this misinformation? So many things, big issues and big questions.
So I'm not an expert social scientist, but I don't think you have to be one to understand that misuse and overuse of social media is problematic, period. And it's algorithmically designed to keep, people hooked. That said, I'm familiar with the fact that there were decades of research on whether all the violence on television made kids more violent. There's no question, there's enormous amount, if you count the number of shootings, stabbings, and killings, per hour of, it's enormous. There is still not agreement, as far as I know, among experts about exactly what was the impact of television when television was a dominant entertainment medium. Social media, I think we're going to be arguing about exactly what it's done for a long, long time to come. But, there's no question, though, in my mind that the stuff that we have and use isn't really designed for our benefit. It's designed to, in this competition, for who can be the world's, first trillionaire. That is an unsolved problem. It is sort of capitalism, run amok. And the internet has been an enormous enabler of that.
So just to follow up on that, since you're a granddad, can I say that?
I am a granddad, yes.
So how would you feel about your grandchildren having a cell phone with one of the smart?
Well, so I've watched I have a granddaughter who's 8 and a grandson who's 4. And I watched what my son and daughter-in-law do. So the 8-year-old has an iPad, but there's this parental access thing that you can you can set it so that it will run for 15 minutes and then it'll stop and they have to report back in and the parent can either give them some more time or not and can see what's running on it. And it's it's a negotiation. It's really at that stage, but it's one controlled by the parents, completely. And it will loosen up. The whole kids and cell phones things with them being banned in schools and there's a pushback, just sort of the average age at which kids are getting cell phones, I think is going to increase. It'll be less of a battle and, good parents will decide when is the right time, for their kids. And they're going to, I don't have a problem saying that parents should supervise, their kids' use. And also have the kind of relationship where they can actually have a conversation about what they're seeing and doing that is age appropriate to those kids.
Okay, thank you. Do we have audience? Anyone? There's a list here. So we'll have some people come up and ask these questions. There's a microphone over there.
Do you want me here?
No, you just stay there and then
Great.
You might be
Okay.
better off.
As a computer science major, do you think it would be more useful to minor in business or investments?
Minor in business or investors? I think it depends on your interests. I mean, if you have a sense of where you want to go, I would pick the thing that matches the one, or the other. I don't think there's a right answer necessarily. I mean, investments will let you go deeper into, I think, into that particular field. Business training leaves you pretty wide open to do all sorts of things. I'd actually try to do a little of both.
Thank you.
Hello. So I've heard this remark that if you want to make a small fortune in VC, you should start with a large one. And so my question is relating to what are your thoughts around any irrational exuberance or kind of very speculative nature of VC that we see, and is that similar to what we observed in the dot-com kind of boom and bust where you had a lot of money going into firms that didn't really have the potential?
Yeah. It's an interesting topic and one that I've looked at a lot. One thing is the vast majority of really big money in venture capital is made by a very small handful of firms and have been doing that for the last, 40 years. Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins, Benchmark. And that the average VC firm actually hasn't done all that well. And so if you're just going into it at random, as it were, you may have overinflated expectations of what's likely to happen. So the people who are really good at it continue to make very large fortunes, but for everyone else, it's a very sort of mixed bag. Yeah. I think I love the early stage part because you get to work with founders very closely. The work is rewarding in and of its own, in and of its own right. But it's not like, forgive me, it's not like crypto where there's, to me there's no underlying value there. That is ultimately just speculation. Maybe somebody will figure out a good use for the blockchain, that's, sort of widely used. We go, oh yeah, it's important. If blockchain went away, we'd all be worse off. But until that happens, what your question was, if you had substituted crypto for VC, my answer would have been, nah.
Let me add on to that, just out of curiosity. I don't know if you know the answer. You said there's a lot of VC firms that are not doing very well. But yet there's so many. So how do you explain that? There's so many, yet they're not doing that well.
Well, some of it is, and it's less the case in 2025 than it was, say, in 2021. There's trillions of dollars of cash that people don't know what to do with, of investable money. And so, it's supply and demand. There was, for a period of time, this nearly infinite supply of people willing to put money into venture capital firms. And so lots of people started firms, but the failure rate of those firms, their ability to raise a second or third fund, actually we're starting to see the numbers. That failure rate is going up because the capital allocators, first of all, don't have the trillions of dollars anymore, but the bloom is off the rose. The other thing is that it sounds like really glamorous in a way, or it's become attractive. It's become like a thing. I mean, I can remember in earlier decades when going into investment banking had that, aura to it. And so if you were at, Harvard or wherever, an astoundingly high percentage of the graduating seniors were going into investment banking. So VC is having its moment. Hopefully that moment that moment is passing and something else will be overinflated and overhyped.
And one more follow-up, and then we have another guest question. You mentioned Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins. They seem to do well. What do you think the secret is?
No, I don't think it's a secret. There's a wonderful book, by the way, called The Power Law by Sebastian Mallory that is the best inside look at actual venture capital and some of the firms that I mentioned and how they did things. It's a good venture investing is a discipline. In fact, each early, seed stage is different than Series A and later. So there's a discipline to it. You kind of understand the life cycle of companies. You understand what tends to make companies successful or not, and founders, and you apply that. I should say it's an apprenticeship type of work, which is to say that people tend to learn how to be good venture capital investors by being part of a process with other more senior people, doing that. It is not a formula or a cookbook. There's always, judgment involved, and it still puzzles me. Some people just seem to have good raw talent for judging what's going to be a successful investment, and other people not so much. And if you have that raw talent, you can develop it and become a good investor. If you don't have that, you should probably find where your superpower is and do something else, because it doesn't matter how hard you work. You're just, if you can't run fast, you're never going to win a gold medal in the Olympics.
Thank you. Next question.
Could you speak on the work you did while at the Mozilla Foundation and what you think its future looks like after the Google anti-competitive ruling?
Well, I can answer the first half. So in the beginning, there was Netscape, the browser that made things made the internet happen. Then Microsoft decided to strangle it, which it did. Netscape, out of desperation and the fact that it didn't matter, decided to open source its browser and became this project inside of Netscape that wasn't going anywhere. It was acquired, Netscape was acquired by AOL, and the Mozilla project was sort of inside AOL, not producing anything that anybody really wanted. But the folks who were doing it really wanted to be freed from the shackles of AOL. And what I did, because I was known to both the leaders of Mozilla, Mitchell Baker on the Mozilla side, and the AOL executives, I helped broker it being spun out into its own thing and getting enough money that it could have a fair chance of standing on its own. And so I became the chair of the Mozilla Foundation. And then folks, and I had nothing to do with this, Firefox started inside the Mozilla project. Everybody inside the project really hated it. I never quite understood why, but they decided to put it out anyway, and it became a huge hit because it was just a browser, but it was good and it was relatively secure. Microsoft Internet Explorer, which had taken over a ton of market share, was a terrible, crappy product at the time, and so Firefox had a lot of momentum. And a guy had the bright idea to monetize the search box. So, you know, it's a browser, it's got a, you know, search. And they sold the right to Google to be the default search engine used. You could change it as a user. That turned out to be worth a lot of money because there were billions of searches being done, and that's what Google monetized. And so that became the basis of Firefox's business model. The thing that I did, besides getting the thing spun out, was to work to figure out the right structure for it, of having the Mozilla Foundation as the umbrella and Mozilla Corp, a corporation, a for-profit corporation that received the revenue, paid its taxes, and then sent money up to the foundation. So I was on the sort of managerial administrative side, but I was an important figure in helping it get to where it got to. Now I don't know so much about, you know, what it can do to in its next chapter, and I certainly hope there is one.
Thank you. We have another audience.
Yeah. What character traits do you look for in founders?
Character traits. I can name a couple. I talked about persistence, you know, some. Coachability is another. I want founders who don't think they know everything, who are interested in taking feedback, in learning, in, you know, things like that. I also look for people who have some real subject matter knowledge. That's sometimes unfashionable, but I have come to be a very firm believer that domain expertise is quite important. So if you're doing an ed tech startup, I'm looking at the founding team, who was actually taught in a classroom. If it's a fintech startup, I'm saying, well, who's worked for a bank, an investment bank, a firm? What's the actual, you know, experience? If you're planning on selling enterprise software, what do you actually know about your customers? And looking for, you know, that some experience in that in the founding team. So,
Thank you.
yeah. And you know, sometimes there's just people I like, and I go, I think that person's gonna. And I can't tell you, you know, why, but it's often worked out well.
Thank you. Any other questions? Here we've got another one.
Since Ludwig loves specific percentages in the questions, so percentage of VC activity which is gap closing versus gap widening.
Half and half? See, well, there are two alternatives you get. Not a lot is specifically gap closing. There's a lot of VC investing that is more or less gap neutral, meaning it's not, the outcome isn't one that obviously is going to make things worse or better. And when we see one of those, the kind of dialogues we have is, well, let's talk about, who your customers are going to be, and are you interested in, serving customers at all income levels? And it's surprising. Some founders care about that a lot, and others don't. Some VCs care about it, and many don't. And the issue there is that VCs get their money from things like university endowments, foundation endowments, high net worth individuals, institutional investors. And so they're ultimately beholden to what those folks want. And if those folks are saying, we just want to make as much money as possible, we don't care how you make it, there's no reason that they would invest in, do anything, different. What we found, not the soft spot, but the thin edge of the wedge for change is with foundations and universities and institutions that have some kind of mission at their core to talk about how come your endowment investing in a way that is aligned with those values. And there is a small but growing movement inside those institutions to do that. And as they do that, they then start talking a different talk to the people they hire as their investment managers, and ask for different things and bring up. So we're doing more work now at that level to try to get momentum going from the limited partners of funds to ask to pick managers that are doing more gap closing kind of work. Still the very beginning, it's early days, and this could be a long, multi-generational battle. I don't want to overstate.
Well, thank you. That would be a great way to end, except for I have to give you one last question.
Last question.
And you've already kind of answered it, but what 3 pieces of advice would you give to students at USF to be successful either in their business career or their life?
I have always believed and continue to believe that understanding your own strengths and weaknesses gives you enormous leverage. And so cultivating a kind of the ability to check in with yourself and be honest with yourself about that, and then apply your findings, huge leverage. Spare yourself from trying to do things that are probably going to be more difficult than what the world will accept, and go in the direction of the talents that each of us have. They're all different, and developing them and putting them out in the world. So knowing yourself, know thyself, not new, a couple thousand years old or more, but that's number one. I think I'm just going to come up with 2 here.
That's great.
Advice. Yeah, I would say trust yourself and be patient with yourself. I mean, that's just super important. I'm just trying to think in my own life, because I was like a super impatient person. And if things worked out great, but if I were redoing things, I think taking a little bit slower, listening to other folks more carefully, and if I did, rather than just rejecting stuff I didn't like, that would be a good thing to do. That's my advice.
Okay, thank you very much.